The morning Danny said those words, I was wearing my blue dye, the dark one, the color of deep river water, the one I only take out when something important is happening. I had ironed it the night before, standing at the board in my bedroom while the incense on Thomas's altar burned down to ash. I don't know why I chose it that day. Maybe some part of me already knew. The salon smelled the way it always had, chemicals and jasmine, and something underneath it all that I could never name, maybe just time. 30 years of it soaked into the walls. Mrs. Clara Hoang was in the second chair, the way she had been every third Saturday since 1996. Her hair thin now, white at the roots, but she still came. She always came. There were 6 other women in the room, customers I recognized, women who had sat in my chairs and told me about their daughters and their husbands and their surgeries and their griefs. They all looked up when Danny walked in. He had Kevin Lamb with him. Kevin always wore the same kind of shoes, expensive, pointed at the toe, the kind of shoes that announce themselves before their owner does. Danny was dressed in a shirt with no collar, the way young men dress now when they want to look serious without trying too hard. He was 31 years old. I had held him when he was 4 days old, in this very city, in a hospital room where the fluorescent light made everyone look like they were already half a ghost. He did not look at me first. That was the first thing I noticed. He looked at the room. He looked at the women in the chairs, at Mrs. Clara Hoang, with her cape around her shoulders, at the girl washing hair in the back. He took in the space the way someone takes inventory of something they believe already belongs to them. Then he looked at me. Auntie, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man performing patience he did not feel. This salon hasn't been yours for a long time. He paused. Let it land. Kevin stood slightly behind him with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, which told me everything about which of them had written those words, and which of them was only there to witness. The name belongs to us now, legally. You're just a guest here, and honestly, we didn't invite you. The room went very still. I heard the water running in the back. I heard the fan above the door turning slowly, the way it always turned, the small click it made on every third rotation because Thomas never got around to fixing the blade before he died. I heard Mrs. Clara Hoang set down her magazine. I smiled. Not a big smile. Just the small one, the one that starts at the corner of the mouth and doesn't reach the eyes because it doesn't need to. The one my mother taught me without ever teaching me. I had simply watched her use it my whole childhood and understood, the way you understand things that are never explained, only demonstrated. Danny was waiting for something. Anger, maybe, tears. Some performance of an old woman losing her footing. His eyes had a particular quality, not cruel exactly, but ready. Braced. He had prepared for a confrontation and I was not giving him one, and that confused him in a way that tightened the corners of his mouth. I said nothing. I turned back to Mrs. Clara Hoang, picked up the comb from the tray, and continued sectioning the back of her hair. My hands were steady. They have always been steady. 41 years behind a chair teaches your hands things your mind forgets they know how to keep moving when everything else wants to stop. Danny said something else. I didn't catch all of it. Kevin said something too, quieter, something about paperwork and procedures. A few of the women in the waiting chairs shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a younger woman, maybe 40, looked at me with an expression I recognized, that particular helplessness people feel when they witness something wrong and don't know whether to speak. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. Not now. Danny and Kevin left 7 minutes later. I know because I counted. When the door closed, Mrs. Clara Hoang met my eyes in the mirror. Rose, she said. Shush, I said. I'm evening your left side. She watched me in the mirror for a long moment. Then she nodded, the way old friends nod when they decide to trust you with something they don't yet understand. That was this morning. Now it is evening and I am sitting at my kitchen table with the windows open and the street outside settling into its nighttime sounds, motorbikes thinning out, a neighbor's television through the wall, someone cooking something with lemongrass 2 doors down. Thomas's altar is in the next room. I lit fresh incense an hour ago, and the smoke is drifting through the doorway in a slow thread, the way it does when the air is still. And sometimes when I see it move like that, I think it is him reminding me he is still paying attention. I have been sitting here thinking about the first day I opened Golden Scissors. It was 1994. November. The city felt different then, not smaller exactly, but closer, the way things feel when you are young enough that the world still has edges you can touch. Thomas had built the sign himself from a piece of wood he found at the market, painted the letters in gold because I told him I wanted something people could see from across the street. He painted it wrong the first time the scissors were pointing the wrong direction, and he painted over it and did it again without complaining. That was Thomas. He never complained about doing a thing twice if the first time wasn't right. I paid the first month's rent with money I had saved for 11 years, coin by coin, in an envelope I kept in the pocket of a winter coat I never wore because I was saving that too. The registration certificate came back with my name on it in black ink rose tea. Nguyen and I stood in this same kitchen and read it 4 times because I couldn't believe they had spelled everything correctly. That nothing had gone wrong? That something I had built in my mind for so long had finally become a document with an official stamp. 31 years ago. Danny was not born yet. Kevin Lamb was a child somewhere, probably scuffing shoes his mother told him to keep clean. The women who would sit in my chairs for the next 3 decades were living their lives, not yet knowing they would find their way to a small salon on a street that smelled of rain and exhaust and, on good days, Jasmine from the cart that parked outside on weekends. And now Danny walks into the room I built and tells me I am a guest. I think about what my mother used to say, on the evenings when she sat on the step outside our house and watched the sun go down over the water. She said it in the way she said everything important quietly, once, without looking at you, as if she were saying it to the air and you were simply fortunate enough to be nearby. Still, water runs deepest. She meant, the ones who say nothing are the ones who have already decided. She meant, do not mistake silence for surrender. She meant, the river does not argue with the stone. It simply keeps moving until the stone is somewhere else. I got up from the kitchen table and went to my bedroom. I knelt down beside the bed slowly, the way I do everything slowly now, not from weakness but from habit, and I pulled out the tin box from under the frame. Green metal, the color faded at the corners. Thomas had painted it that color because I asked him to. The same week he painted the sign. I don't open it often. I don't need to. I know what's inside. I set it on the bed and put my hand flat on the lid and stayed like that for a moment, feeling the cool metal under my palm. Danny thinks the name is gone. He is about to learn what 31 years actually looks like. Thomas used to say that a house becomes a home the way a person becomes old. So gradually you don't notice it happening, until one day you look around and realize everything has changed. And you wouldn't have it any other way. He said things like that. Not often, and never when you were ready for them. He would be fixing something, a hinge, a drawer that stuck, the fan above the door that he never quite got around to finishing, and the words would come out of him the way water comes out of a crack in a wall, slow and steady, and without announcement. I spent 37 years married to that man, and I am still not sure he understood how much I listened. Our house is old, not the oldest on the street, but old enough that the walls remember things the people inside them have forgotten. The floors are tiled dark green, white grout gone gray from decades of feet and mops and the particular kind of humidity that settles into everything here in the wet months. Thomas chose the tile himself. He laid half of it and then threw out his back and had to lie on the mat in the front room for a week, directing me on how to finish the rest. I did it wrong in one corner, and he never mentioned it, not once, not in all the years after. But I knew. Every time I walked through that doorway, I felt the slight unevenness beneath my feet and thought of him lying there, patient, watching me work. He died 6 years ago. A stroke. It happened in the afternoon while I was at the salon, and he was in the garden, which is where he spent most of his retirement not doing much, just sitting with his coffee and watching things grow. The neighbor found him. By the time I got there, the paramedics were already inside, and the coffee cup was still on the garden table, still warm, and that detail broke something in me in a way that the larger facts could not. I set up the altar that same week, in the room off the hallway, the room that used to be where Thomas kept his tools and his woodworking projects. It seemed right. That room smelled like him, sawdust and machine oil and something underneath it all that I couldn't name, the way the salon has its own smell I cannot fully describe. I put his photograph in the center, the one from our trip to the rock, where he is squinting into the sun and smiling slightly, the expression of a man who is quietly happy and slightly embarrassed about it. I put a small cup for tea on the left, a holder for incense on the right. I learned the proper way to light the incense from my mother, who learned it from hers. And that line of knowledge going back through the women of my family is one of the things I hold carefully, the way you hold something you know cannot be replaced. I talk to him sometimes. Not every day. Not in any particular way. But when something is happening that he would want to know about, I stand in the doorway of that room, and I say it aloud, quietly, and then I listen to what the silence answers. It sounds foolish when I write it this way. It does not feel foolish when I do it. The night Danny came into the salon, I stood in that doorway for a long time, but I am getting ahead of myself. I want to tell you about Danny the way I knew him before any of this because that version of him existed, and it matters, even now when it is difficult to hold both things at once. The boy I remember, and the man who walked into my salon with his pointed shoes and his rehearsed words. He came to us when he was 4 days old. His mother, Thomas's younger sister, had delivered him in a difficult labor and then fallen into a deep illness that lasted several months. She could not care for him during that time. We had no children of our own. It was a grief I had made my peace with, slowly and imperfectly, the way you make peace with most things, and so Danny came to live in this house on the green tile floors and slept in a crib Thomas built over 2 weekends from a kit that had instructions in 3 languages, none of which were Vietnamese. He was a quiet baby. Watchful. He had Thomas's sister's eyes, very dark, very still, the kind of eyes that seemed to be measuring something. I used to sit with him in the evenings on the step outside while Thomas cooked, and I would point to things, the motorbike passing, the neighbor's cat, the sky changing color, and tell him the names. He would look at what I pointed to with great seriousness. He was 4 months old. He could not have understood any of it. But he looked. And I talked, and that was our language for a while. He stayed 18 months. When his mother recovered and came to take him home, he cried, not for long, not dramatically, but the sound of it stayed with me. A small grief, the first of several I would carry for that boy. After that, he came every school holiday, every Tet for 12 years. Thomas taught him woodworking in the small garden room, and he had no patience for it and no talent either, but he tried because Thomas asked him to, and that is the version of Danny I return to when I try to understand how we arrived at this moment. A boy who tried at things he was bad at because he respected the person asking. His mother remarried when he was 9. His stepfather was a businessman successful by most measures, which is to say he had money and the confidence that money produces. Danny grew up watching that man move through the world as though it owed him things. And I watched Danny learning to move the same way, slowly, the way children learn the shapes of the people around them and begin to inhabit those shapes themselves. I noticed it. I said nothing. It was not my place, and besides, children always find their own directions. I told myself that. I paid for 1 semester of his business degree. He asked me quietly, separately from his family, which told me the asking embarrassed him, and also that he genuinely needed it. I did not make him explain himself. I wrote the transfer, and told him to work hard, and that was the end of it. He thanked me with a formality that was somehow more touching than warmth would have been. That was 8 years ago. In those 8 years, I had seen him at holidays and the occasional Sunday dinner when his mother hosted. He had become fully the thing I had seen forming in him: polished, assured, quick to calculate, slow to commit. He smiled often. The smile didn't always reach those still dark eyes. Kevin Lamb appeared in his life around 3 years ago. Danny mentioned him the way people mention things they want you to know without making a point of telling you casually, in passing, as though the information were unimportant. A business partner. They were working on something together. He was vague about the details. I should have asked more questions. Thomas would have asked more questions. He had a gift for that, for sitting across from someone at a table and simply waiting, comfortable in the silence, until the other person filled it with the thing they had been deciding whether to say. I am less patient. I take people at what they offer me. It has served me well most of my life. It is possible it served me poorly here. I am sitting at the kitchen table now, this same table where Thomas and I ate 37 years of meals, where Danny sat as a child with rice on his chin and serious eyes, where the edges are worn soft from elbows and years, and the particular tenderness of ordinary life. The tin box is in the bedroom. The incense has burned down. Outside, the street is quiet now. I have been thinking about the way the room felt when Danny said those words this morning. Not the words themselves, I have turned those over enough times that they have gone smooth, like stones in water. I mean the room, the particular quality of the silence after, the way Mrs. Clara Hoang's hands stilled on her magazine, the way Kevin stood behind Danny and looked at the floor. Kevin looked at the floor. I keep coming back to that. A man who brings you bad news looks at the floor when he delivers it. Not because he is ashamed, necessarily. Sometimes because he is thinking about what comes next. Sometimes because he knows something the person delivering the news does not. There is something Kevin Lamb knows that Danny hasn't told me yet. I can feel it the way I can feel rain coming before the sky changes a particular quality in the air, a heaviness in things that are usually light. I don't know what it is, but I know it is there. And I know it is larger than a name on a door. 3 weeks before Danny walked into the salon with Kevin Lamb and his rehearsed words, a letter arrived. I almost missed it. The mail here comes at irregular hours, slipped through the slot in the gate, and landing on the tile floor in a small pile that I collect in the evenings when I come home. Most of it is nothing, advertisements for things I don't need, utility notices, the occasional card from a former customer who has moved away and still thinks of me at holidays. I have a particular routine with the mail. I pick it up on my way to the kitchen, set it on the corner of the table, make my tea first, and then go through it slowly, the way Thomas taught me to approach things that can wait. He said most urgency is invented. He was usually right. This envelope was different from the others, thicker, official looking. The return address was from a business registration office I didn't immediately recognize, not the local branch I had dealt with 30 years ago, but a regional office, somewhere in the administrative district across the city. I made my tea first. I kept the routine. Then I sat down, set the other mail aside, and opened it. The language was formal and dense, the way official documents always are, written not to inform but to protect the people who wrote it, layered in conditionals and references to statutes I would need a lawyer to explain. I read it twice, then a third time. Then I set it down on the table and looked at the window and watched a motorbike pass, and then another one, and then the neighbor's boy walking home from somewhere with his backpack hanging off one shoulder. What the letter said, as best as I could understand it through the formal language, was this. A business entity called Golden Scissors Holdings LLC had been registered with the Regional Commercial Bureau, claiming the name Golden Scissors as a protected trade name, with application for exclusive use across the province. The registration had been filed 6 weeks earlier. It had been approved. The letter was a courtesy notice, which is to say, it was not asking my permission. It had already been done. The letter was informing me of a fact that existed whether I knew it or not. I sat at that table for a long time. I thought about the first time I registered Golden Scissors. 1994. I had gone to the local office with Thomas, who carried the folder because he said I would forget it on the bus, which was probably true. The woman at the desk had been stern and unhurried and slightly annoyed at everything, the way people in official positions sometimes are, and she had taken our papers and stamped them, and handed back the registration certificate with my name on it, and Thomas had squeezed my arm in the corridor afterward and said, quietly, so that only I could hear, "There it is." That certificate was in the tin box under my bed. It had always been in the tin box. I had not looked at it in years because I had not needed to. It was simply there. The way foundations are simply there, you don't think about them until something shifts. I read the letter a fourth time. The name on the LLC registration was not mine. I did not call Danny that night. I want to be clear about that, not because I was afraid of the conversation, but because I needed to understand what I was looking at before I said anything to anyone. This is something Thomas used to say about carpentry, and I have always applied it elsewhere. Measure twice before you cut. He meant it literally. I mean it the way I mean most things he taught me, which is to say I have expanded it until it fits every situation that matters. I called instead a woman named Phuong, who had worked for a commercial law office for 20 years, and who had her nails done at my salon every 2 weeks for the last decade. She owed me nothing, and I owed her nothing. We had simply been in each other's lives long enough that a call at 8 in the evening was not unusual. I read her the letter over the phone. The silence on her end was the kind that means the person is thinking, not the kind that means they are uncertain. Phuong was rarely uncertain. That was one of the things I valued about her. Do you have your original registration? she asked. Yes, from 1994, November 1994. Another pause. Then you have something, she said. Whether it's enough depends on how they filed. Some of these new registrations are built on the assumption that the original business never formalized properly, or that the owner let the registration lapse. Did you renew? I thought about it. The honest answer was that I did not remember the specific mechanics of renewal. I had always paid my fees, always kept my licenses, but the details of each filing had blurred over 30 years into a general sense of compliance rather than a precise record. I paid everything I was asked to pay, I said. That's not the same thing, she said, but gently. Bring me what you have. The tin box, the receipts, whatever Thomas kept. We'll look at what you're working with. I told her I would come by in the morning. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen again, in the dark, because I had not turned on the light and it had gotten late without my noticing. The incense on Thomas's altar had gone out. The street outside was quiet. Through the doorway I could see the small light I keep burning near his photograph, not a candle, just a small electric lamp with a warm bulb, the kind that makes the photograph look like a window into somewhere else. I thought about Danny. I thought about the conversations we had never had, the ones where I might have asked more carefully about what he was doing, what Kevin Lamb had proposed, what they were building together. I thought about the last Sunday dinner at his mother's house, maybe 5 months ago, where he had been distracted and checked his phone more than usual and said very little about work when his mother asked. I had noticed. I had filed it away under the general category of young men under pressure and thought no more of it. The letter sat on my kitchen table. I got up eventually, put it in the tin box not with the original certificate, but on top of it, so that when I opened the box the two documents would be side by side, the thing I had built and the thing someone was trying to replace it with. I don't know exactly why I did it that way. Maybe because I wanted them to see each other. Maybe because I wanted to see them together. In the morning I would go to Phuong. She would look at my papers. She would tell me what I had and what I was missing and what the options were. That was tomorrow. That was the practical thing. But that night, in the kitchen, in the dark, I thought about Kevin Lamb standing behind Danny at the salon entrance 3 weeks later with his eyes on the floor. I hadn't known yet to think about Kevin Lamb the night the letter arrived. I only knew his name in the vague way you know the names of people your family mentions in passing, a shape without a face, a name without a history. By the time he stood in my salon with his hands in his pockets and his expensive shoes, I would know considerably more. But what I still didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, in a way I was not prepared for, was that the letter was not the beginning. The letter was the part they wanted me to see. The part they didn't want me to see had started long before. Phuong's office was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of old paper and floor wax, and the particular staleness of rooms where serious things happen slowly. I had been there once before, years ago, for something to do with the salon lease renewal, and the smell was exactly the same. Some places preserve themselves that way, not through effort but through the accumulation of the same days, repeated. She was already at her desk when I arrived. Tea made, my documents spread across the cleared surface in front of her. I had called ahead. She was that kind of person. She prepared before you arrived, so that when you sat down, the time was already being used. I had always appreciated that about her. I sat in the chair across from her and put my hands in my lap and waited. Your original registration is clean, she said, without looking up from the certificate. 1994, correctly filed, your name, the address. The stamp is from the local commercial bureau, which had jurisdiction at the time. She turned the page. Renewal fees paid 1,997, 2001, 2006. She paused, and then a gap. I kept my hand still. How large a gap? The next renewal I can find is 2019. She looked up at me then. There are 13 years between 2006 and 2019, where I see no provincial renewal filing. I thought about those years. 2006 to 2019. They were not blank years. They were full years, busy years. Years of customers and early mornings, and the particular rhythm of a working life. Thomas's health had begun to change sometime, around 2012. My mother had died in 2014. There had been a period, I could not say exactly when, where the administrative layer of things had slipped. I had paid what people asked me to pay. I had assumed that was enough. Fuang had told me, gently, on the phone, that assumption and legal standing were different things. Does the gap invalidate the original registration? I asked. Not necessarily. It weakens it. A gap that long gives opposing counsel room to argue abandonment that you stopped actively maintaining the registration, which in some interpretations constitutes a relinquishment of protected status. She set the certificate down carefully, the way you set down something fragile. It doesn't mean you lose. It means the ground is softer than it should be. I nodded. I had expected something like this, not the specific years, not the exact language, but the shape of it, the feeling that what I had assumed was solid had a seam in it somewhere, and that someone had found the seam before I did. What about their filing? I asked. She slid a printed copy across the desk. Golden Scissors Holdings LLC. Registered 8 weeks ago. The named directors were 2 people. Kevin Lam, listed first. And a name I didn't recognize, a man named Bao Trin, listed as co-director. Danny's name was nowhere on the document. I looked at it for a long moment. Danny isn't listed. No, Fuang said. He isn't. She watched me read the document. Does that name mean anything to you? Bao Trin? Nothing. He's a property developer. Mid-sized operation, mostly commercial. He and Kevin Lam have co-registered 2 other LLCs in the last 3 years, one in the hospitality sector, one in retail leasing. She had done more research than I had asked for. I was grateful for that, and also, underneath the gratitude, something that felt like the beginning of a colder feeling. They have a pattern. They identify established small businesses with strong local reputations, look for registration weaknesses, and file for the name. I set the printed document down on the desk. This is what they do. It appears so, and Danny brought them to me. She didn't answer that directly. She was a precise woman, careful with what she confirmed versus what she implied. Danny would have had detailed knowledge of your salon's history, the name, the founding date, the customer base, the reputation. He would have known things about the administrative history of the business that an outsider would have had to research. She let that sit for a moment. Whether he shared that knowledge voluntarily or whether it was obtained another way, I can't tell you. I thought about every conversation I had ever had with Danny about the salon. Holiday dinners where he asked, with what I had taken for affectionate interest, how business was going. Visits to the shop where he walked through slowly, looked at the photographs on the wall, asked about the older customers by name. A phone call 2 years ago, maybe longer, where he had asked, casually, so casually, whether I had ever thought about franchising. I had laughed. I had told him I was 67 years old, and franchise was a word for younger people. He had laughed too. He had been measuring the room. The whole time, he had been measuring it. I asked Fuang what my options were. She listed them: a challenge to the new registration, a formal claim of prior use, the possibility of a civil filing if we could demonstrate harm. She said the words in her measured way, giving each option equal weight, not steering me toward any particular direction. That was her professional courtesy. What I heard underneath it was the architecture of a long fight, months, possibly years, expensive, uncertain, contingent on the gap in my filing history. I thanked her. I took back my documents, placed them carefully in the folder Thomas had labeled years ago, in his careful carpenter's hand, one word, in blue ink, that I had never needed to use until now: evidence. On the way home I stopped at the market. Not for any particular reason, I simply needed to walk somewhere before I sat still again. The market in the morning has a particular quality I have always found useful for thinking. Too much noise to hear your own worrying. Enough movement around you that your feet make decisions without consulting your mind. I walked the length of it once, past the vegetable stalls, and the woman who sells dried fish and the boy with the phone cart who always offers to repair cracked screens, and I let myself think about nothing useful. Then I thought about Fuang saying Danny would have had detailed knowledge. And then I thought about something else, something I had set aside when I read the letter 3 weeks ago, because it had seemed like a small detail, the kind of thing the mind notes and then releases. In the Golden Scissors Holdings LLC registration, in the fine print at the bottom of the founding document, There was a line I had passed over quickly. Business address. The street address listed was not Kevin Lamb's office. It was not a commercial building downtown. It was not any address I associated with Kevin Lamb, or Bao Trin, or their other holdings. The business address on the Golden Scissors Holdings LLC registration was the address of my house. I had read it and set it aside. I had told myself it was a mistake, a misprint, the kind of administrative error that happened in documents filed through third parties. I had made a note to ask Phuong about it and then, in the focus of the larger conversation, had forgotten to raise it. I stopped in the middle of the market aisle. A woman with a basket moved around me without comment. The dried fish smell was very strong. I was thinking about what it meant for a business to be registered to your home address without your knowledge. Not just the legal inconvenience of it. Something more specific. Something Phuong had said in passing, almost as an aside, when explaining the mechanics of these LLC registrations. She had said, any liability attaching to the business entity can, under certain filing structures, be pursued against assets associated with the registered address. At the time, I had been focused on the name, on the registration, on the years between 2006 and 2019. I had not followed that sentence to where it led. I followed it now, standing in the market with my folder under my arm and the noise of the morning all around me. If Golden Scissors Holdings LLC accrued debt, or if someone sued them, or if a financial obligation came due that they could not or would not pay, and if my home address was listed as the registered business address, then the house Thomas built with his hands, the house with the green tile floors and the altar in the back room and the fan above the door that still clicked on every third rotation. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. Unknown number, local prefix. I answered. The voice on the other end was a man's voice, professional, unhurried, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering information that changes things. He said he was calling from a commercial property firm. He said they were reaching out to the listed contact for Golden Scissors Holdings LLC regarding a pending transaction. He said he understood I was the property owner of record, and he wanted to confirm that I had received the disclosure documents related to the franchise sale. I said, "What franchise sale?" And he said, very politely, as though this were a simple misunderstanding easily resolved. The sale of the Golden Scissors brand and operational rights, currently under contract for $280,000, pending final signature from all registered parties. I stood in the market and did not speak. He asked if I was still there. My name, he said, was listed as a registered party, and I thought, they had forged more than a registration. Phuong called me back on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual. She was a woman who preferred to deliver news in person, over tea, in a setting she could control. When she called instead, I knew before she spoke that what she had found was something she didn't want to sit with any longer than necessary. "Rose," she said. "Are you home?" "Yes." "Sit down." I was already sitting. I didn't tell her that. She had spent 2 days going through the LLC filing for Golden Scissors Holdings, not just the surface registration, which was what the courtesy letter had summarized, but the full submission packet, which Phuong had requested through her contacts at the Commercial Bureau. It had taken some doing, she said. The filing had been structured carefully, in a way that suggested whoever prepared it knew exactly how to make things difficult to access quickly. Kevin Lamb, she told me, had a history with this kind of work. She had pulled 3 other LLCs associated with his name, not through official channels, just through the professional network she had built over 20 years in commercial law. All 3 followed the same pattern. Identify an established local business with weak or informal documentation. File a parallel registration under a new entity. Then approach the original owner with an offer. Sometimes the offer was a buyout. Sometimes it was a partnership. Sometimes, if the original owner was elderly or unwell or simply tired, they waited. He's done this before, I said. At least 3 times that I can confirm. Possibly more. He's careful. I thought about Kevin standing behind Danny with his eyes on the floor. Careful. Yes. That was the word. What else? I said, because I could hear in Phuong's voice that she was working toward something, building toward it the way you build toward difficult news, slowly and with preparation. She was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a woman choosing her words. "Rose, The LLC registration lists an address for the business. The salon address. No, she said. Your home address. I set my tea down. She continued, and I listened, and as she spoke, I felt something shift in the room the way air shifts before a storm. Not dramatically, not with any visible sign, but in a way the body registers before the mind catches up. The LLC for Golden Scissors Holdings had been registered using my home address, this house, the house with the green tile floors and Thomas's altar and the tin box under the bed as its official place of business. Danny had used my address without asking me, without telling me. He had listed this house, my house, as the operating address of a company that had been built to take what I spent 30 years building. What does that mean legally? I asked. My voice was very even. I noted this with a small, distant part of myself. It means that if the LLC incurs debts, business loans, vendor contracts, legal judgments, the registered business address becomes relevant to collection proceedings. It doesn't automatically make you liable, but it creates a paper connection between you and the entity that a creditor's attorney could argue. It also means, she paused, that any official correspondence sent to that LLC goes to your home, which means you could have been receiving their mail, or not receiving it, if Danny was intercepting it at your gate, before you noticed. I sat with that for a moment. The mail. I thought about my routine, picking it up in the evenings, setting it on the corner of the table, making tea first. I thought about the weeks after Danny had visited for tech, 6 months ago, when I had come home twice to find the gate slightly ajar. I had assumed I had not latched it properly. I was tired in those months. I had not thought to question it. He was checking my mail, I said. I can't prove that, Fuang said carefully. But the structure of this, the home address, the timing, the courtesy letter that was written in language dense enough to confuse someone without legal background. This was designed to give you as little time as possible to respond before the registration became fully entrenched. How much time do I have? To contest the registration formally, 60 days from the date on the courtesy letter. You have 31 days remaining. 31 days. The same number of years I had held the name. I thanked Fuang. I told her I would come by the office Thursday. I hung up and sat in the kitchen while the afternoon light moved across the tile floor in the slow way it does this time of year. The long slant of it touching the edge of the table and then moving on. I thought about Danny at 4 days old. The way he was watchful even then. I had thought, when he was a baby, that the watchfulness was intelligence. I still believed that. I simply understood now what he had been watching for. I got up and walked to the front gate, opened it, looked at the mail slot. There was a small mark on the inner edge of the slot, a faint scratch in the metal, the kind a key makes when it misses the lock and catches the edge instead. It was possible Thomas had made that scratch decades ago. It was possible the postman had made it last week. It was also possible someone had stood at my gate on an evening when I was at the salon and reached through the slot with a key or a thin tool and sorted through what was there. I closed the gate, latched it, stood on my own front step in the late afternoon, and looked at the street. The motorbikes passed. A child somewhere was being called inside for dinner. The lemongrass smell drifted from 2 doors down. The same as always. The world continuing its ordinary business, while mine rearranged itself beneath my feet. I went back inside and opened the tin box. The original certificate was there. My name in black ink, the official stamp, the date in November 1994. Below it, the letter from the regional office. And below that, something I had placed there 2 days ago after my first meeting with Fuang, a photograph I had found in the drawer of Thomas's old work table, which I had gone through for the first time since his death. The photograph was of the salon on its first day. 1994. I am standing in front of the sign Thomas painted, wearing a white blouse I no longer own, squinting into the light. Thomas is beside me, his arm around my shoulder, also squinting, also smiling. The sign above us reads Golden Scissors in gold letters, the scissors pointing the right direction because he painted it twice. On the back of the photograph, in Thomas's handwriting, Rose's Place, Day 1, we did it. I had not known the photograph existed until I found it in that drawer. He had never shown it to me. He had simply kept it, the way he kept things that mattered to him, quietly, and without announcement, in a place where they would wait until they were needed. I set the photograph back in the box. Close the lid. 31 days. I thought about Kevin Lam's other 3 LLCs, the pattern Phuong had described, the careful architecture of confusion and delay. I thought about the other original owners, the ones who had been elderly or tired or simply unprepared. I wondered what had happened to them. I did not ask Phuong because I was not sure I wanted to know, not yet. Not while I still needed to be clear-headed. But there was one more thing Phuong had said before she hung up, something she had mentioned, almost in passing, in the tone she used for information she was not yet certain how to classify. She had found, in the public filings associated with Golden Scissors Holdings LLC, a document she described as a letter of intent. It was not legally binding at the filing stage. It was early paperwork. But it indicated that Golden Scissors Holdings had entered into preliminary discussions with a third party, a regional spa and beauty corporation, she said, one that had been expanding aggressively into provincial markets over the last 18 months. The letter of intent referenced a proposed transaction value, $280,000. That was the number Phuong said, and I had not responded. And she had waited. And I had still not responded. And then she had said my name gently, and I had said, yes, I'm here. And she had said, Rose, they're not just taking the name, they're selling it. And that was when I understood that the Salon, the 30 years, the gold letters Thomas painted twice to get them right, all of it had been converted, in some office I had never visited, into a number on a letter of intent. A transaction, a line in someone else's spreadsheet. And I had not been informed, and I would not have been. The question that sat with me through the rest of that evening, through dinner I did not finish, and tea I let go cold, was not whether I could stop it. It was how long they had been planning it, and whether Danny had known the full amount from the beginning, or whether even Danny did not know everything Kevin Lam had arranged. I have never been the kind of person who announces what she is doing. Thomas used to say this was my most useful quality, and also, occasionally, my most frustrating one. He meant it with affection. A woman who does not announce her intentions is a woman who finishes what she starts without interference. That was how I had always worked in the salon, in the house, in every situation that required patience over speed. I did not tell people what I was building until it was built. By then there was nothing left to argue about. I applied the same principle now. The Thursday meeting with Phuong lasted 2 hours. She had organized everything on her desk before I arrived: the LLC filing, the letter of intent summary, the public records she had pulled on Kevin Lam's other registrations, printed and sorted into a sequence that told the story clearly. Phuong was a woman who respected clarity. I had always appreciated that about her. We talked through the 60-day window. We talked through the original certificate, which she examined carefully, holding it to the light near her window the way people examine things they want to fully believe. She said it was solid. She said the stamp and the date and the filing number were all consistent with 1,994 records she had seen before. She said the photograph, Thomas's photograph, the one I had found in the drawer while not legally required, was the kind of supporting material that told a human story alongside a legal one, and that human stories mattered in proceedings like this more than people expected. What she needed from me, she said, was documentation of continuous operation. Proof that Golden Scissors had been actively running under my ownership from 1,994 to the present day, without significant gaps. Business license renewals, tax filings, receipts, client records, if I had them. Anything dated, anything with my name attached. I told her I would bring what I had. I did not tell her what I suspected about the mail, or about the gate, or about Danny visiting at Tet with his distracted eyes and his unanswered questions. Not yet. I needed to understand what I was holding before I put it on someone else's table. I went home and spent the rest of that afternoon in the back room, Thomas's room, the one with the altar, but also the one with the wooden shelving he had built along 2 walls, where he had kept his tools and where I, after he died, had moved certain papers and boxes I didn't know where else to put. I had not gone through those shelves methodically since the first year after his death, when I had needed the distraction. I went through them now. The shelves held more than I remembered. Thomas had kept everything not in the way of a hoarder, but in the way of a man who understood that things outlast people, and that what survives matters. There were receipts going back to 1,991, 3 years before the salon opened. for tools and materials. There were the business license renewals, each one in its own envelope, dated and stamped, going forward from 1,994 inches, a nearly unbroken line. There were tax documents, carefully filed, cross-referenced in his handwriting with the corresponding year on the outside of each folder. My husband had been keeping my records better than I had known. I sat on the floor of that room for a long time, not because I was tired but because I needed to stay there. Near the altar, near his photograph with the dull sunlight and the slight embarrassed smile, I did not say anything to him. I just stayed. Then I began to organize. My mother had a saying she used when we were children, and she found us trying to carry too much at once: groceries, books, whatever the day required. She would say, "The bamboo bends so it does not break, but it bends one direction at a time." She meant, do not try to carry everything simultaneously. She meant, move in one direction, then the next. She meant, patience is not weakness, it is strategy. I bent toward the documents first. By Friday morning, I had a complete file covering 31 years of operation. License renewals, tax records, supplier receipts, even some of the old appointment books from the early years, when I had kept handwritten schedules, names and times, and small notes about what each customer preferred. Mrs. Clara Hoang appeared in the 1997 book. Then the 1,998, then every year after. 31 years of third Saturdays, written in my own hand, and then in the hand of the girls who worked for me, and then in the digital system I had switched to in 2015. It was, I thought, as complete a record of a life's work as most people ever leave. I brought it all to Phuong the following Monday in 2 large folders in a cardboard box. She looked at the box for a long moment and then looked at me. "You had all of this," she said. "Thomas kept it." She nodded slowly. "Then we have a case," she said. "A strong one. The work of assembling the legal argument I left to Phuong. That was her territory, and she knew it better than I would ever need to. My territory was different. My territory was the thing she could not do, which was to continue being exactly who I appeared to be while learning what I did not yet know. I went back to the salon the following week as though nothing had changed. This required a certain discipline, the kind that comes not from effort but from long practice. I had been a hairdresser for 41 years. I had stood behind chairs while customers told me things they had not told their husbands, their sisters, their doctors. I had learned, across those decades, that the most important skill in my profession was not the cutting, or the coloring, or the styling. It was the ability to be present without demanding anything, to be someone a person could talk to without feeling observed. I applied that skill to Danny. He came by the salon on a Wednesday, about 10 days after the confrontation. He came alone this time, which told me he wanted something softer than what Kevin Lamb's presence had produced. He was wearing a different kind of shirt, less formal, an attempt at approachability. He bought a coffee from the cart outside before coming in, and he handed one to the girl at the front desk, which was the kind of gesture that works on people who don't know to look for it. He sat in the small waiting area and spoke to me while I worked on Mrs. Bin's color, a woman in her early 60s who understood instinctively when to look at her magazine. He said he hoped we could talk. He said things had gotten off on the wrong foot. He said Kevin could be direct in ways that didn't always land well, that the intention had never been to upset me, that there were possibilities here that might actually benefit me. I listened. I nodded at the appropriate moments. I asked him, in the mildest voice I owned, what kind of possibilities he meant. He talked about partnership, about the brand being expanded, about how my years of experience and reputation could be an asset to the new structure, about a consulting role, a percentage, something formal that recognized my contribution to what Golden Scissors had become. He used the word legacy. He used it twice. I watched his hands while he talked. Danny had never been good at keeping his hands still when he was nervous. Even as a child, he had fiddled with the edges of things, with buttons, with whatever was within reach. Now his right hand moved against the arm of the chair in a small repetitive motion, a slow tap that he wasn't aware of. He was nervous. He was nervous, and he was here without Kevin, and he was using words like legacy and partnership and consulting role, which meant one of two things. Either Kevin had sent him to soften me up before the next stage of the plan, or Danny was beginning to feel something about this situation that Kevin had not anticipated when he designed it. I let him finish. I thanked him for coming. I said I would think about what he had said, and that we could talk more soon. I smiled the small smile, the one that starts at the corner of the mouth, and turned back to Mrs. Bin's color. Danny left looking slightly relieved, which meant he had interpreted the smile incorrectly. He had always misread still water. That evening, I called Mrs. Clara Hoeing. Not about the case. I had not told Clara everything yet, and would not until I was ready. I called because Clara had been coming to the salon since 1996 and because, before she retired, she had spent 22 years as a teacher who paid close attention to which students were struggling and why. She noticed people. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether she had ever seen Kevin Lamb before the day he came with Danny, whether she recognized him from somewhere, anyone she might know. Clara was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was reaching for something specific. There was a man, she said slowly. Last year, maybe 14 months ago, I saw him standing outside the salon after you had closed. He had a phone, and he was taking photographs. Of the salon? Of the building, she said. The exterior. The sign. I thought he was from a real estate company, the kind that scouts locations. I didn't think to mention it. 14 months ago, 6 months before Kevin Lamb introduced himself to anyone as Danny's business partner, he had been watching the salon for a year before any of this began. He had chosen it deliberately, methodically, from the outside in. He had selected it the way you select a property for its value, for its history, for the particular kind of owner who was least likely to fight back quickly. I said goodnight to Clara, set the phone down on the kitchen table. The street outside was quiet. The incense I had lit after dinner was still burning, a thin line of smoke moving through the doorway from Thomas's room. I opened my notebook, a plain one, green cover, the kind Thomas used for his measurements, and wrote Kevin Lamb's name at the top of a new page. Below it, I wrote, 14 months. Below that, I wrote, what else did he see? The plan was longer and older than I had thought, and if it was longer, it was more complicated. And if it was more complicated, there were parts of it I had not yet found. I turned the page and started a new list. I had 27 days left, and somewhere inside a plan that Kevin Lamb had spent over a year building, there was a piece he had not yet shown Danny. I intended to find it before the 60 days were gone. They came on a Friday morning. I know it was Friday because I had just finished my tea and was preparing to open the salon when I heard the truck on the street outside, a large flatbed, the kind that carries equipment too heavy for a regular vehicle. I went to the window first, the way I always go to the window when something sounds different from the ordinary. It is a habit from 40 years of living on a street busy enough to require attention. The truck had stopped in front of the salon. There were 3 men in it, none of whom I recognized. They moved with the efficiency of people who had been told exactly what to do and were being paid by the hour to do it. One of them carried a folded piece of paper, a work order, I assumed, which he consulted once and then tucked into his back pocket. They began unloading equipment from the truck bed, scaffolding, a wrapped package that was long and flat. The shape of a sign. I stood at my window and watched. Danny arrived 12 minutes later in his car. Kevin Lamb arrived 2 minutes after that in a separate vehicle, which told me they had driven from different directions, which told me they had not been together that morning, which told me in the small algebra of behavior I had been studying for 6 weeks that Kevin had wanted to arrive independently, to be seen as arriving independently, to maintain the appearance of a man who was present professionally rather than personally. He stood on the sidewalk in his pointed shoes and looked up at the front of the building with an expression I can only describe as proprietary, the expression of a man looking at something he believes he owns. I put on my jacket. I went outside. The morning air was cool and smelled of exhaust and the bread cart that came through at this hour every day. 2 of my regular customers were already waiting by the salon door, Mrs. Lan, who came every Friday without fail, and a younger woman whose name I was still learning. They both looked at the truck, at the equipment, at Danny and Kevin, and then at me. I smiled at them. The small smile. I said good morning and told them to wait just a moment inside. The door was open. They should make themselves comfortable. Then I walked toward Danny. He saw me coming, and his expression shifted in a way I had learned to read over the past weeks, a slight tightening, a preparation. He had been expecting this moment and had prepared for it. He straightened slightly, the way people straighten when they want to appear more certain than they are. "Auntie," he said, "we're updating the signage today. It's part of the rebrand." "The rebrand," I said. "Golden Scissors Holdings has retained a design firm. The new visual identity is ready." He said this the way someone recites something they have practiced, the language slightly more formal than his natural register. Kevin's language, I thought. Kevin's words in Danny's mouth. Kevin himself had drifted a few steps away and was speaking on his phone, turned slightly from us, performing a lack of interest in our conversation. That was itself a performance of confidence, the kind that says, "I don't need to manage this because it is already managed." "You are removing my sign," I said. "We're replacing the exterior signage with the new brand identity. It's a standard part of any relaunch." Danny's voice was patient in the way that is designed to make the other person feel unreasonable. I recognized the technique. I had watched it deployed on other women in other contexts over the course of my life. "That sign has been on this building since 1994, I said. "And it's done its job," he said. "Now we're taking the brand to the next level." "Auntie, this is good news. This is growth." One of the workers had begun assembling the scaffolding. The metal poles clanked against each other in the morning air. Mrs. Lon's face appeared briefly in the window, watching. I looked at Danny for a long moment. He held my gaze, which told me Kevin had coached him on this specifically to not look away, because looking away concedes something. He was doing well. He had been taught carefully. "I would like to see the work order," I said. A brief pause. "It's a standard commercial signage installation. There's no reason." "I would like to see the work order," I said again, in the same voice, at the same volume. Kevin ended his phone call and walked over. He produced the paper from his jacket pocket, not the worker's copy, but a second copy, cleaner, which meant he had brought it deliberately, anticipated this moment. He held it out to me. I took it, read it carefully. The work order was made out to Golden Scissors Holdings LLC, authorized signatory Kevin Lamb, for removal and replacement of exterior signage at this address. Everything was in order, everything was legal. The LLC was registered. The authorization was signed. The address was correct. My address, my building, my sign. All of it processed through a company that did not exist 3 years ago. I handed the paper back. Kevin took it and folded it with a precise, unhurried movement, and put it back in his pocket. "We'll have the new sign up by this afternoon," he said. "We're keeping the name Golden Scissors so the brand recognition carries over. The new design is cleaner, more modern. I think you'll find it's actually an improvement." He said this kindly. That was the worst part of it. He said it in the voice of a man who is doing someone a favor and knows it and is waiting to be thanked. I said nothing. I went back inside. The scaffolding went up over the next hour. I worked through it. Mrs. Land's standing appointment, the younger woman's trim. 2 walk-ins who came at 10 and seemed confused by the activity outside but said nothing. I worked with my hands and kept my face arranged in the expression of a woman who is simply doing her job, which was not entirely an act, because my hands at least knew what they were doing, even when the rest of me was somewhere else. At 11:40, the old sign came down. I heard it before I saw it, a particular sound, metal brackets releasing, the scrape of something being separated from a surface it had occupied for 31 years. I did not go to the window. I kept my hands moving. Mrs. Bin, who had come in for a trim and known me long enough to understand that silence sometimes required company rather than conversation, caught my eye in the mirror and said nothing, which was exactly right. The new sign went up at 1:30. It was, as Kevin had said, cleaner, modern. The same 2 words, Golden Scissors, in a sans serif font that had no relationship to Thomas's hand-painted letters. The scissors in the logo were a geometric abstraction, precise and symmetrical and utterly without history. It looked like something that could belong anywhere. Which was, I supposed, the point. Danny came to the door at 2 o'clock. He did not come inside. He stood in the doorway and looked at me across the salon and said, "It looks good, doesn't it?" With the tone of a man who has won something and is giving the other person a moment to acknowledge it graciously. I looked at him. I thought about Thomas painting the original sign twice, the scissors pointing the wrong direction the first time, and then again the right way because he would not leave it wrong. I thought about the photograph in the tin box. I thought about Thomas's handwriting on the back. Rose's place. Day 1. We did it. It's a sign, I said. Danny nodded once, as though I had agreed with him, and left. The afternoon customers came and went. By 5 o'clock, the truck was gone and the scaffolding was gone and the street looked the way it always looked, except for the new sign above my door that belonged, on paper, to someone else. Phuong called at 5:15. I had texted her a photograph of the work order before giving it back to Kevin. She had spent the afternoon making calls. Rose, she said. The signage replacement was filed with the Commercial Bureau this morning as a formal declaration of operational control. They've moved faster than I expected. With the sign change on record, they're establishing a public-facing claim that the rebrand is complete and the transition is underway. How many days do I have left? A pause. 19. 19 days. The scaffolding was gone. The sign was up. Kevin Lam was filing paperwork designed to create the appearance of a transition already completed, a fait accompli, a story with its ending already written. I locked the salon at 6, stood outside for a moment and looked up at the new sign. Then I looked at the wall beside the door, the place where the old brackets had been, where Thomas's sign had sat for 31 years. The wall was lighter there, a rectangle of paint slightly less weathered than everything around it, an outline of absence, a ghost of the original. It was still there, if you knew where to look. I went home, made tea, sat at the kitchen table and opened my green notebook to the page with Kevin Lam's name at the top. 19 days, a sign that no longer said what I had built, a filing designed to make the world believe the matter was already settled. Phuong had said we had a strong case, but a strong case needed time, and time was the one thing Kevin Lam had been carefully, methodically, deliberately taking from me since before I knew his name. What I needed was something that worked faster than the 60-day window, something that did not require a proceeding or a filing or 19 more days of waiting while Danny and Kevin built walls around what I had made. I looked at the notebook. Below Kevin Lam's name, below 14 months, below what else did he see, I had written, in the days since Clara's phone call, a list of names, vendors, former employees, other business owners on this street, people who had watched the salon exist for 3 decades and might, if asked the right question in the right way, remember something worth remembering. There was one name near the bottom of the list I had not yet called. A woman who had worked for Kevin Lam's previous LLC. One of the 3 Phuong had identified. She had left that company abruptly, 18 months ago, 2 weeks after the original owner of that business had signed away her registration. I had her number. I had been waiting until I understood enough to ask the right question. I picked up the phone. Her name was Min. She had worked as an administrative assistant for Kevin Lam's second LLC, the one Phuong had traced, the property management company that had absorbed a small family-owned fabric shop 18 months ago, and she had left 2 weeks after the original owner signed the transfer papers. She agreed to meet me on a Saturday morning at a tea house near the University District, far enough from the Salon neighborhood that neither of us was likely to be recognized. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s, with the careful posture of someone who had spent years sitting at desks, and the careful eyes of someone who had spent those same years watching things she hadn't been meant to see. She ordered jasmine tea. I ordered the same. We sat by the window and I let her take her time, because some conversations cannot be rushed, and this was one of them. She had heard about my situation through a network I hadn't known existed until Phuong mentioned it, a loose group of small business owners and their employees who passed information quietly, the way people pass warnings about weather, because the weather affects everyone and some storms announce themselves only to those who know what signs to look for. She said she wanted me to understand something before she told me anything. What I'm going to tell you, she said, I should have told someone a year and a half ago. I didn't, because I was afraid, and because I needed the job, and because I told myself it wasn't my business. She looked at her tea. It was my business. I know that now. I waited. Kevin Lam doesn't just acquire businesses, she said. He acquires the histories of businesses, the reputations, the customer bases that took owners decades to build. He looks for businesses that are old enough to have real value and owned by people he believes are too old or too isolated or too trusting to understand what the paperwork means until it's too late. She had been the one who processed the correspondence for his LLC. She had been the one who drafted letters, filed documents, managed the administrative machinery of what Kevin presented to the world as a legitimate business development operation. She had been good at the work because she was organized and thorough, and had not, at first, understood what she was organized and thorough in service of. The moment she understood had come 18 months ago. She had been processing a file, the fabric shop acquisition, and had found, in the digital archive she maintained, a folder she had not created. It was nested inside the general correspondence folder, labeled with a date and a set of initials she didn't recognize. Inside were documents she described to me slowly, watching my face as she spoke. I kept my face still. I had been keeping my face still for 60 years. I kept it still now. The documents were financial projections, not for the fabric shop, which had already been acquired. For a list of future targets, businesses Kevin had identified as acquisition candidates, ranked by estimated transfer value, assessed on a set of criteria she read me from memory: years of operation, owner age, owner health status, presence of heirs, current legal standing of registration, community profile. My salon was on the list. She had seen my name, Rose Nguyen, Golden Scissors. Est. 1,994 inches, a document that had been created 14 months before Danny walked into my salon with Kevin Lamb and said those words. Before the courtesy letter from the regional office, before any of the things I had understood as the beginning of this, I had been chosen long before I knew I was being looked at. There's more, she said. She set her tea down. She had not drunk much of it. Her hands were very still on the table. The stillness of someone who has been carrying something heavy and is about to set it down. The file had a section I didn't understand at first. A communication log between Kevin and a contact he referred to in the documents only by initials. She paused. D.T. The tea house was quiet around us. Someone at another table was reading a newspaper. The street outside moved in its ordinary Saturday rhythm. I was aware of all of it and none of it. Denny Tran, I said. She nodded. How long? The first message in the log was dated 22 months ago. 22 months. Danny had been communicating with Kevin Lamb for 22 months. 2 months before Kevin had begun physically surveilling the salon, the photographs Clara had seen from the street. 22 months before Danny walked into my salon and said, "This salon hasn't been yours for a long time." Danny had not been recruited into Kevin's plan. Danny had not been manipulated or deceived or used by a more sophisticated operator. Danny had come to Kevin. The communication log, as she described it, showed a young man who had identified an asset he believed he was entitled to and sought out someone with the technical expertise to extract it cleanly. The asset was my life's work. The someone was Kevin Lamb, the boy I had held at 4 days old. The boy who had sat on my front step and learned the names of things from my hand. The boy Thomas had taught woodworking with patient, unhurried afternoons in the back room, even though the boy had no talent for it and no patience, and Thomas had known both of those things and taught him anyway, because that was who Thomas was. That boy had looked at what I built and calculated its market value and gone looking for someone to help him take it. I set my own tea down. Very carefully. The way you set something down when your hands are not entirely reliable. She was watching me. Her face had the expression of someone who has delivered a wound and cannot undo it, and is simply present for what comes after. There's something else, she said quietly. The financial projections in that file. The estimated transfer value for Golden Scissors. She hesitated. It wasn't 280,000. I looked at her. That's what the letter of intent says. The number they've shown in the official filing. She folded her hands on the table. The internal projection Kevin prepared for his investor contacts puts the actual transaction value at $415,000. The difference between what the public documents show and what Kevin's private projections show goes somewhere else, I said. A holding account, she said. Not accessible to the LLC. Not reflected in any document Danny would see. She looked at me steadily. He's stealing from Danny too. Danny just doesn't know it yet. The tea house moved around me. The newspaper reader turned a page. Someone ordered something at the counter, and the woman behind it replied, and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Saturday continued, as though the world had not just shown me something I could not put back. I thought about Danny's face when he had visited the salon after the confrontation, trying to be soft, using Kevin's language about legacy and consulting roles and partnership. the nervous tap of his hand against the chair arm. I had read it as guilt, or ambivalence, or the discomfort of a man who had done something he could not entirely justify to himself. I had been wrong. Or I had been right, in the wrong direction. The discomfort was real, but it was not about me. It was the discomfort of a man who had entered into a partnership and was beginning to sense, in the way you sense things before you can name them, that the person he partnered with had a different accounting of what the partnership meant. Danny had delivered me to Kevin Lamb. And Kevin Lamb was going to deliver Danny to the same place he delivered everyone emptied out and dismissed once the transaction was complete. She reached into her bag and set a folder on the table between us. "I kept copies," she said. "Before I left. I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but I knew I was going to need them for something. I just didn't know what." I looked at the folder. I did not open it yet. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "The woman who owned the fabric shop," she said. Her name was Mrs. Duke. She was 67 years old. She had run that shop for 24 years. When the transfer went through and she understood what had happened, she stopped. Started again. She got sick. "Not from the shock," her doctor said. "But I don't believe that. I think some things break something inside a person that doesn't heal the same way." Her voice was even, but her eyes were not. "I didn't help her. I'm helping you." I put my hand flat on the folder. Inside it was everything she had described: the communication log, the financial projections, the internal documents that showed 2 sets of numbers for the same transaction, the initials DT, in 22 months of correspondence that mapped, precisely and without ambiguity, how this had been built, and by whom, and when. I sat in that tea house on that Saturday morning, and I felt something I had not felt since the morning after Thomas died, when I had woken up and reached for him in the bed, and found the empty space and understood all over again, in the body before the mind, what loss felt like. Not because Danny had done this, but because Thomas had taught him, in that back room, with the woodworking kit and the patient afternoons and the unhurried care of a man who believed the boy was worth investing in, and the boy had taken everything Thomas gave him and built something with it. Just not the thing Thomas had in mind. I closed my hand around the folder. Outside, the Saturday street went on being a Saturday street. Somewhere a cart was selling bread, somewhere a child was being called home. I had 19 days. And now I had everything I needed. What I did not yet know was whether I could do what needed to be done, because what needed to be done would require me to look at Danny and show him what was in this folder. And when I did that, whatever remained between us would be changed in a way that no certificate and no courtroom and no amount of time would ever fully undo. Some doors, once opened, do not close. I was about to open one. I did not sleep well that Saturday night, but it was not the sleeplessness of despair. It was the sleeplessness of a mind that has finally found solid ground and cannot stop walking it, measuring it, learning its edges. I lay in the dark and thought about sequence. Sequence matters more than most people understand. In the salon, I learned this early: the order in which you do things determines not just the outcome but the quality of everything that follows. You do not color before you cut. You do not cut before you consult. You do not consult before you listen. Each step creates the conditions for the next, and if you rush or rearrange, the whole thing becomes something less than it should be. Not wrong, necessarily. Just less. What I had now was everything I needed. The original certificate from 1,994 inches, the tin box. 31 years of continuous operation documentation in 2 folders, and a cardboard box at Phuong's office. The folder Min had given me at the tea house, with the communication logs, and the double accounting, and the initials DT stretching back 22 months. Thomas's photograph with his handwriting on the back, which was not legal evidence but was true in a way that legal evidence sometimes fails to be. What I needed now was sequence. Sunday morning I was up before the light changed. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table with the green notebook, and wrote out what I had in one column, and what still needed to happen in another. The notebook had belonged to Thomas. He had used it for measurements, for the careful calculations of a man who worked with wood, and understood that the difference between correct and almost correct was the difference between something that held and something that didn't. I had been using it for a different kind of measurement, but the principle was the same. The first call I made on Monday morning was to Phuong. I told her about Min. I told her about the folder. I described the contents carefully. Watching her silence on the other end of the phone, which was the silence of a lawyer finding the shape of something she had been hoping for without knowing exactly what shape it would take. The double accounting, she said finally. If those figures are documented the way you're describing, they are. Then we have something that goes beyond the registration dispute. She paused. This is fraud, Rose. Not just against you. Against the buyer. Against Danny. Kevin Lam has been running 2 sets of books on a single transaction and using a family member as the public face of the operation to limit his own exposure. I know. I need to see the folder today. I'll bring it this afternoon. I also told her about Danny. About the 22 months of correspondence. About the fact that Danny had not been an unwitting participant but an initiating one, however much Kevin had subsequently maneuvered around him. Phuong was quiet for a long moment. That complicates the sympathy calculation, she said. In a proceeding, his involvement from the beginning makes a leniency argument harder to sustain. I'm not interested in leniency, I said. I'm interested in accuracy. She said she would have everything reviewed and organized by Wednesday. She said she would contact Edward Park, the IP attorney she had recommended 2 weeks ago, whom I had met briefly and found to be a man of few words and precise ones, which was the kind of lawyer this situation required. She said we would meet together on Thursday and discuss how to proceed. I said good. I hung up. I made more tea. The second thing I did that Monday was go to the salon and open it as I always did. At the hour I always opened it, wearing clothes appropriate to a woman running her own business on an ordinary Monday. The new sign above the door did not change what happened inside. Mrs. Lan came for her standing appointment. 2 walk-ins came before noon. The girl who helped me on Mondays arrived at 9:30 and we worked through the morning without drama, without announcement, without any indication visible to the outside world that anything was different from any other Monday in the past 3 decades. This was important. I cannot overstate how important this was. Kevin Lam's strategy, as I had come to understand it, depended on the assumption that I was doing what he expected, worrying, perhaps consulting someone, perhaps writing letters that would arrive too late and accomplish too little. His timeline was built on a particular model of how a woman in my position would respond to pressure, slowly, emotionally, without the professional infrastructure to move faster than his legal architecture. I did not intend to disrupt that assumption until I was ready to disrupt it completely. On Tuesday, I went to the business licensing office, not the regional bureau, but the local branch, the one I had first visited with Thomas in 1994. I had been there many times since, for renewals and fee payments, and the occasional administrative question. The man at the counter recognized me. We had spoken perhaps a dozen times over the years. He was not a friend, but he was the kind of acquaintance built from repeated contact and mutual professional courtesy, which in practical terms is often more useful than friendship. I told him I was researching the history of my registration for a legal matter, and asked what records they retained from 1994 onward at the local level. He told me what they had. I asked whether those records would be accessible as certified copies for use in a formal proceeding. He said yes, with the appropriate request form. I filled out the form while standing at the counter. He told me the copies would be ready Thursday. I thanked him and left. I did not explain the legal matter. He did not ask. Wednesday morning I went through the tin box one final time. I do not mean I reviewed the documents, though I did that too. I mean I went through it the way you go through something when you want to know it completely, not for information but for understanding, for the particular confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you hold and why it matters. The certificate. The photograph. Thomas's handwriting on the back. The letter from the regional office. Minge folder, which I had placed on top when I returned home Saturday night, so that when I opened the box the 2 oldest things and the newest thing were all visible at once. I sat on the bed with the box open on my lap and I thought about Mrs. Duke, the woman who had owned the fabric shop. I did not know her. Min had given me only her name and the broad outline of what had happened to her, but I thought about her the way I sometimes think about people I will never meet, with a particular attention, a particular respect for what they had survived or not survived. 24 years she had run that shop. And then she had gotten sick, in the way Min described. The way that happens when something inside a person breaks at a level the body registers before the doctors do. I was 69 years old. My hands still worked. My mind was clear. Thomas had been keeping my records since 1994. I was not going to become the version of this story that ended with someone else deciding what my work was worth. Thursday arrived. I picked up the certified copies from the licensing office at 8 in the morning, placed them in a separate envelope brown, the kind Thomas had used for important documents, and drove to Phuong's office. Edward Park was already there when I arrived, sitting across from Phuong's desk with his briefcase open and a legal pad in front of him that was already half covered in his small, precise handwriting. We spent 2 hours at that table. I will not describe every detail of that conversation because much of it was technical, the kind of legal analysis that belongs to lawyers and that I followed closely but am not qualified to reproduce. What I will say is that by the end of those 2 hours, 3 things were established clearly. First, the original certificate, the 31 years of continuous operation documentation, and the certified copies from the local licensing office constituted, in Edward Park's assessment, a registration claim that would withstand formal challenge. My name had been on that business since before Danny Tran was old enough to understand what a business was. Second, the documents in Min's folder, the communication logs, the double accounting, the internal projections showing 2 different transaction values constituted evidence of financial fraud that extended beyond the registration dispute into territory that involved the commercial bureau, the prospective buyer, and potentially the financial crimes unit of the local authority. Third, we had 15 days remaining in the 60-day window. 15 days was enough. It was, as Edward Park said in the careful language of a man who does not make promises, more than sufficient if we moved correctly and without delay. I signed the authorization forms he required. I provided copies of everything. I shook hands with both of them and said I would be available by phone at any hour. Then I drove home. I made dinner. I ate it slowly, at the kitchen table. In the particular quiet of an evening where everything that needed doing had been done, and what remained was simply to wait for what came next. After dinner, I lit incense on Thomas's altar, and stood in the doorway for a while, not saying anything, just present. The new sign above the salon door was 2 weeks old. Kevin Lam had filed his declaration of operational control. Danny was operating on the assumption that the woman he had grown up watching was going to run out of time. 15 days. I went to bed at 9 o'clock and slept without difficulty. The sleep of a woman who has measured everything twice and made her cut. The storm I had been building, quietly, in the spaces between ordinary days, was ready. All that remained was to let it arrive. The meeting at the Commercial Bureau was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. Edward Park had requested it through the formal dispute resolution process, which required both parties to appear before a bureau officer with documentation supporting their respective claims. The letter went to Golden Scissors Holdings LLC at its registered address, which was, of course, my home address, and so I received it along with my own copy, which meant I read the notification twice from 2 different envelopes on the same morning, which struck me as the universe's particular sense of humor about the situation. I arrived at 20 minutes before 9. The bureau occupied the 4th floor of a government building that smelled of floor wax and recycled air, and the particular bureaucratic stillness of places where decisions are made slowly and documented carefully. I had been here before, years ago, for routine matters that I no longer remembered specifically. The chairs in the waiting area were the same green I associated with official spaces everywhere, a green chosen not for any aesthetic reason but because it was available in bulk and unlikely to show stains. Edward Park was already there, standing near the window with his briefcase and his legal pad, and the expression of a man who has prepared thoroughly and is at peace with that preparation. Phuong sat beside him. I sat on his other side and set the tin box on my lap, and folded my hands on top of it and waited. Kevin Lam arrived at 8:58 with a lawyer I had not seen before, a younger man, well-dressed, carrying a leather portfolio that was too new to have seen much use. Kevin wore his usual pointed shoes. He looked at me when he entered, a brief assessment, and then looked away in the manner of a man who has decided the outcome of a situation before it begins and is simply present to formalize it. Danny arrived at 9:02. He came in alone, which surprised me. He looked between Kevin's group and mine, and something moved across his face, not quite uncertainty, not quite guilt, something between them that didn't have a clean name. He sat in the chair Kevin indicated, on the opposite side of the table from where I sat, and he did not look at me again. The bureau officer was a woman in her 50s named Miss Vo. She had the manner of someone who had seen many of these proceedings and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. She arranged her documents, confirmed the names of all parties, explained the process in terms that were clear and without ornamentation, and opened the floor to the claimant's representative. Edward Park stood. He spoke for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall behind Miss Vo's head, not from impatience but from the same instinct that makes me count things when I need to stay grounded: the rotation of the fan in the salon, the minutes Danny spent in the waiting chair, the days remaining in a 60-day window. 11 minutes? And in those 11 minutes, he laid out the case with the precision of a man who has organized something complex into a sequence so clear that its logic becomes self-evident. The original registration from 1994, the continuous operation documentation covering 31 years, the certified copies from the local licensing office, the systematic pattern of Kevin Lamb's previous LLC acquisitions, the double accounting in Min's documents, showing two sets of figures for the same transaction. The communication log establishing Danny's involvement 22 months before any public action was taken. He set each document on the table as he referenced it, building a stack that was not dramatic in its height, perhaps 2 inches, but was, in its accumulation, the weight of 31 years made visible. Kevin's lawyer spoke next. He was polished and quick and argued, as Fwang had anticipated, that the original registration had been informal, that the LLC filing represented a legitimate modernization of an established brand, and that the dispute was essentially a family disagreement being elevated unnecessarily to a formal proceeding. He used the word confusion twice. He used the word elderly once. And then, registering something in Miss Vo's expression, did not use it again. Miss Vo asked questions. She asked them of Edward Park, and then of Kevin's lawyer, and then she turned to the table and asked if the original certificate holder wished to make a statement. I had not planned to speak. Edward Park had not suggested it, but Miss Vo was looking at me with the expression of a woman who has spent her career in a room where documents speak and people are reduced to their paperwork, and who, on occasion, finds it useful to let the person behind the paperwork say one thing. I stood. I opened the tin box. I took out the photograph, Thomas's photograph, the one I had found in the drawer of his work table after he died, the one I had not known existed until I needed it most. I set it on the table facing Miss Vo. This is the salon on its first day, I said. November 1994. That is my husband Thomas, who built the sign. He painted it twice because the first time the scissors were pointing the wrong direction, and he would not leave it wrong. I paused. He passed away 6 years ago. He kept every document, every receipt, every renewal for 31 years. He kept them because he understood that what we built was real, and that real things deserve to be protected. I sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, not the performed quiet of a legal proceeding between speakers, but a different kind, the kind that happens when something true has been said in a place accustomed to the language of argument. Kevin's lawyer shuffled his papers. Kevin himself looked at the table. His face was composed, but his right hand, resting on the portfolio in front of him, had tightened slightly. I had spent 6 weeks watching Kevin Lamb perform certainty, and I had learned, in that time, to read the small places where the performance slipped. It was slipping now. Miss Vo reviewed the documents for 14 minutes. She made notes. She referred once to her computer, typing something, and reading the screen with the focused attention of someone cross-referencing. Then she set her pen down and looked across the table. She spoke for 4 minutes. I will not reproduce her precise language because it was official language and I am not a lawyer, and it is not my place to translate what belongs to that register. But what she said, in its essential meaning, was this. The original registration of golden scissors under the name Rose T. Nguyen in November 1994, combined with 31 years of documented continuous operation, constituted a prior claim that the LLC filing could not supersede. The LLC registration was not void, it would require a formal cancellation process, but its claim to the trade name was not supportable in the face of this documentation. The proceeding would be referred to the appropriate authority for full review, with the Bureau's preliminary finding noted in support of the original registrant. She also noted, without elaborating, that certain documents submitted in evidence raised questions that fell outside the scope of her office and would be referred to a separate authority for assessment. She meant Minge folder. She meant the double accounting. She meant Kevin Lamb's private projections and the gap between what the official filing showed and what his investor communications promised. Kevin's lawyer began to say something. Miss Vo looked at him in the way that closes conversations, and he stopped. I did not look at Kevin when the meeting ended. I had nothing to say to Kevin Lamb and no performance to offer him. He had made his calculations about what kind of person I was: too old, too trusting, too isolated to move fast enough, and the calculations had been wrong, and there was nothing for me to add to that. I looked at Danny. He was still sitting in his chair. His lawyer, Kevin's lawyer, technically, though the distinction had probably never felt more significant to Danny than it did at this moment, had already moved toward Kevin and was speaking quietly to him. Danny had not moved. He was looking at the stack of documents Edward Park was carefully returning to folders, and his face had the expression of a man who was doing arithmetic he did not expect to be doing, arriving at a sum he did not anticipate. He looked up and found my eyes. I did not smile. Not the small smile. Not any smile. I simply looked at him the way I had looked at him across 31 years, the baby in the hospital, the boy on the front step learning the names of things, the young man at the kitchen table signing papers I had paid for with 11 years of savings, and I let him see all of that looking back at him from where I stood. Then I picked up the tin box and walked out. In the corridor, Phuong touched my arm briefly. Edward Park said the follow-up documentation would be filed by end of week. I thanked them both. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood waiting, the tin box under my arm. The building quiet around me. What Kevin had said to Danny, what Danny had arranged with Kevin, what the next weeks would bring in terms of proceedings and referrals and the grinding institutional machinery of consequence, all of that would unfold in its own time, in rooms I might or might not be present in, according to processes I would leave to people who understood them better than I did. I had done what I came to do. I had walked into a room where a man with pointed shoes and a rehearsed manner had decided I was a guest in my own life. I had put 31 years on a table, and I had let it speak. Danny had told me, 6 weeks ago, that the salon hadn't been mine for a long time. He had said it in front of my customers, in front of Mrs. Clara Hoang, in front of women who had known me since before he was old enough to understand what the word mine meant. He had been wrong about the salon. He had also been wrong about something else, something I had never said aloud and did not need to say aloud, because it was true whether or not anyone acknowledged it. I was not a guest. I had never been a guest. The elevator arrived. I stepped in, the doors closed. Outside, the city continued its ordinary Tuesday, and somewhere above it, on the 4th floor of a government building that smelled of floor wax and recycled air, a bureau officer named Miss Vo was writing a preliminary finding that would outlast everyone in that room. 31 years, written down and stamped and filed. Real things, Thomas had known, deserved to be protected. He had been right about that. He had been right about most things. I heard about most of what followed from other people. This is the nature of a certain kind of justice. It does not require your presence to complete itself. You do the necessary work. You place the necessary documents on the necessary tables, and then the machinery that exists for exactly these situations takes over and runs without you. I had spent 6 weeks in the middle of everything. Now I stepped back and let the middle find someone else to occupy. Phuong called on Wednesday evening, 2 days after the bureau meeting. She had heard from Edward Park, who had heard from the authority Miss Vo's office had referred the financial documents to. The referral had moved faster than anyone expected, which Phuong said was unusual and which she attributed to the specificity of the documentation, the double accounting, the gap between the public filing and Kevin's private projections, the communication log that established a pattern rather than an isolated incident. When a pattern exists in paperwork, she said, investigators tend to move. Kevin Lamb's other LLCs had been flagged for review, all 3 of them the property management company. The 2 others Phuong had traced in the early weeks were now part of a broader assessment that had nothing to do with my salon specifically, and everything to do with the methodology Kevin had been applying across multiple targets over several years. My case, with its complete documentation and its clear timeline, had provided the through-line investigators needed to connect what had previously appeared to be separate transactions. I was, Fuang said, something of an anchor point. I thought about Mrs. Duke, the woman who had owned the fabric shop, the one who had gotten sick. I did not say this to Fuang, but I thought it clearly, the way you think things you intend to hold rather than release. If the investigation helped Mrs. Duke in any way, even indirectly, even after the fact, then the tin box and the 31 years, and all the weeks of careful, quiet work had accomplished something beyond the recovery of my own name. Sometimes justice has a wider radius than the person who sets it in motion. The partnership between Danny and Kevin dissolved, as far as I could determine, within 72 hours of the bureau meeting. I did not witness it. I pieced it together from fragments, a call from Danny's mother, who phoned me on Thursday morning in the trembling voice of a woman who has just understood something she should have asked about sooner. A brief message from Clara, who had heard something from the wife of a man who worked in the same building as Kevin's lawyer. The particular silence from Danny himself, who had called me twice after the meeting and left no voicemail either time, which told me he wanted to speak but had not yet decided what he wanted to say. What I understood, from the fragments assembled, was this. Danny had confronted Kevin the evening after the bureau meeting. He had gone to Kevin's office, not called, gone in person, which in my experience indicates that a person needs to see the face of the one they are confronting, because the face will tell them something the voice can hide. He had asked Kevin about the financial projections, about the gap between the public transaction value and the internal figures, about the holding account that Min's documents referenced. Kevin, according to what I was able to piece together, had not denied it. He had explained it. He had used the language of business sophistication structures, instruments, allocation of risk, the language designed to make the person listening feel that their confusion is a function of their inexperience rather than a function of being deceived. Danny had heard this language before, I imagined. Kevin had probably used versions of it to bring Danny into the arrangement in the first place. The difference was that Danny had now seen the specific numbers, and specific numbers do not dissolve into abstraction the way general assurances do. Danny had walked out of Kevin's office and not returned. By Friday, Kevin Lamb had retained a new lawyer, a different one. Not the polished younger man from the bureau meeting, but a more senior attorney whose specialty, Fuang noted with the dry precision she used when something was simultaneously professional and ironic, was financial crime defense. The Golden Scissors Holdings LLC filed for voluntary dissolution the following Monday. I learned about this from Edward Park, who sent me a brief message with the filing number and the date and 3 words at the end. Registration restored, effective immediately. I read the message standing in the back room of the salon, between a customer's color processing and her rinse, and I said nothing and returned to my work. The new sign above the door came down on a Wednesday. Not because anyone forced it, the process for that was still formally underway, but because Danny arranged it himself. He hired a different crew, 2 men with a ladder and the appropriate tools, and they took down the sans serif letters and the geometric scissors and the clean modern design that had belonged nowhere in particular, and had stood above my door for exactly 23 days. I was inside when they did it. I heard the sound of the brackets releasing, the same sound I had heard in reverse 3 weeks earlier, and I set down my comb and stood still for a moment with my hands quiet at my sides. Mrs. Clara Hoeing, who was in my chair for her standing appointment, watched me in the mirror. "Rose," she said. "One moment," I said. She waited. Outside, there was the sound of something being carefully lowered. Then I picked up the comb and continued. The original sign was gone. Of course, I had not expected to recover it. Thomas had built it from wood and paint, and 2 attempts at getting the scissors right. And wood and paint do not survive removal and storage with any dignity. But the wall above the door was clean now, and the lighter rectangle where the sign had hung for 31 years was visible again. That outline of absence, that was also an outline of presence. I had ordered a new sign. I had taken Thomas's photograph to a woman I knew who did fine painting work, the careful kind, and I had shown her the original image. The gold letters, the scissors pointing the correct direction, the particular weight of the font Thomas had chosen because it looked serious without being severe. She had studied the photograph for a long time. It would not be identical, she said. She could come very close. Close was enough. Close was what all repair looks like, not the original, but an honest response to it, a continuation rather than a replacement. The new sign would be ready in 2 weeks. Danny called on Thursday evening. I answered, because I had decided I would when the time came, and the time had come. He did not apologize immediately. I respected that more than I would have respected a quick apology, which is the kind that serves the person giving it, rather than the person receiving it. He was quiet for a moment after I said hello, and then he said, "I don't know where to start." "Start with what's true," I said. Another pause. I thought. He stopped. Started again. I told myself it was accelerating something that would happen eventually anyway. That you were going to leave the business to me at some point. That I was just moving the timeline. He was quiet. I know that doesn't make it right. I'm not saying it to explain. I'm saying it so you know what I was thinking. I know what you were thinking, I said. I've known for some time. He didn't ask how. Perhaps he understood that a woman who had been watching him since he was 4 days old had certain advantages in that regard. Kevin was not what I thought he was, Danny said. No, I said. He wasn't. He wasn't going to give me what he promised either, was he? It was not a question. He had done his own arithmetic by now and arrived at his own sum. No, I said. He wasn't. The silence between us was different from the other silences of the past weeks. Not the silence of strategy or of waiting, or of a woman measuring before she cuts. It was the silence of two people who have known each other a long time and have done damage to that knowing and are standing in the damage, not yet sure what to do with it. What happens now? Danny asked. The authorities will conduct their process, I said. That has nothing to do with what I decide about you and me. And what do you decide? I looked out my kitchen window at the street. A motorbike passed. The neighbor's light was on. The ordinary evening continued its ordinary business. I thought about Kevin Lamb saying the name belongs to us now, legally, with his eyes on the room and his assessment of what I was and wasn't. I thought about Danny behind him, standing just slightly to the left, which was where he had always stood in my life, near enough to matter, far enough to preserve the option of distance. He had taken that option. He had chosen the distance. And then the distance had shown him what it contained. And he had walked back. What he had done was not the kind of thing that resolves. It was the kind of thing that changes the shape of everything that comes after. Permanently, the way a healed bone is never quite the same bone. You carry the knowledge of the break even when the break is no longer visible. But I was 69 years old. I had carried other knowledge of other breaks. I was still here. I don't know yet, I said. That's the honest answer. I don't know. He said he understood. He said he would wait. He said, and this part he said quietly, the way Thomas used to say the things that mattered, as though the volume should match the weight that he was sorry. Not the quick kind. The slow kind that knows it will need to be demonstrated rather than simply said. I said good night. I hung up. The Salon had its name back. The proceedings against Kevin Lamb were underway. The LLC was dissolved. The name on the registration was mine, had always been mine, would remain mine. Kevin had believed I was a guest in my own life. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong in the particular way of people who look at still water and see only the surface, who never understand that what lies beneath the surface is precisely the point. I was not a guest. I had built the room. I had learned its every corner. And when someone came to tell me my time in it was over, I had simply reached under my bed, opened a tin box, and placed 31 years on a table. The table had done the rest. The new sign went up on a Friday morning in early autumn. I had chosen Friday deliberately. Thomas and I had opened the salon on a Friday in November 1994, because the woman at the licensing office had told us the certificate would be ready by end of week, and Thomas had said, "Why wait until Monday? Let's begin while the week still has something left in it." That had been his way, not impulsive, never impulsive, but unwilling to defer a good thing when the good thing was ready. I stood on the pavement outside and watched the two men work. They were careful with it, which I had asked them to be, and which they were, lifting the sign in its wrapping and positioning it against the brackets with a patience that the work deserved. When they removed the wrapping, the gold letters caught the morning light the way gold catches light, not by shining outward but by holding it, keeping it, giving it back slowly. Golden scissors. The scissors pointing the correct direction. Mrs. Clara Hong stood beside me on the pavement. She had arrived 40 minutes early for her appointment, and had said nothing when I told her why, just nodded and put her bag down and stood beside me to watch. 31 years of third Saturdays. She understood without being told that some things require a witness. When the sign was fully up and the men had checked the brackets and stepped back to look at their work, Clara put her hand briefly on my arm. Not a squeeze, not a gesture of emphasis, just a hand on an arm, the way you mark a moment that does not need words added to it. I looked at the sign for a long time. It was not identical to the original. The painter had said that honestly from the beginning she could come close, she could be faithful, but 31 years of weathering, and the particular character of Thomas's hand, were not things that could be perfectly reproduced. What she had made was a continuation, an answer. The same name in the same spirit, carried forward from the place where the original had been interrupted. I thought that was enough. I thought that was, in fact, exactly right. We went inside. Clara took her chair. I picked up my comb and began the third Saturday the same way I had begun every third Saturday since 1996, and the morning moved through its ordinary paces, the sound of the street outside, the smell of the products I had used for decades, the quiet conversation of women who had been coming to this place long enough that the comfort was built into the habit of arriving. At 11 o'clock, the door opened, and Min came in. I had invited her. She had hesitated when I called, in the way of someone who is uncertain whether an invitation carries an obligation she isn't sure she can meet, and I had told her simply that I wanted to say thank you in person, in the place where the thank you belonged. She had said yes, after a pause that told me the yes mattered to her, which was why I had asked. She sat in the waiting area with a cup of tea the girl at the front desk brought her, and we spoke briefly when I had a moment between customers, not about the investigation, which was ongoing and not mine to discuss, and not about Kevin Lamb, whose name I had decided to use only when strictly necessary and otherwise to set aside entirely. We spoke about the salon, about how long it had been open, about what the street had looked like when I first arrived. She asked questions the way people ask questions when they are trying to understand something that matters to them, and I answered the same way, and by the time she left at noon she was not crying, which I had thought she might be, but was instead wearing the expression of a woman who has set something down that she had been carrying for too long. I understood that expression. I had been wearing it for a number of weeks myself. In the afternoon, I did something I had not done in 6 years. I went into the back room, Thomas's room, the altar room, the room that smelled of wood and old tools and the slow accumulation of incense burned in small daily increments over the years since he died, and I took his photograph down from the altar. Not to remove it, to clean it. The frame had gathered dust in the way that frames do when they stand still long enough, and I had been meaning to attend to it for months and had not found the right moment. I wiped the frame carefully with a soft cloth. I cleaned the glass over his face, the Dalat photograph, the squinting sunlight, and the slight embarrassed smile of a man who is quietly happy and doesn't quite know what to do with being seen in that happiness. I set it back in its place, adjusted it until it was level. Then I opened the tin box, which I had brought from the bedroom and set on the work table, and I took out the photograph he had kept in his drawer, the one I had found after his death, Rose's place, day 1. We did it in his handwriting on the back, and I placed it beside his altar photograph, leaning it against the frame. The two images side by side, the man in the Dalat light, and the two of us in front of the sign on the first day, both squinting into the sun because we had positioned ourselves wrong for the photograph, but neither of us had thought to move. I stood there for a while. I kept it, I said to him. It took longer than it should have, and I made some mistakes I wouldn't make again, and I had help from people I hadn't expected. But the name is on the door, our name, the one you painted twice to get the scissors right. The room was quiet in the way of rooms where people have spent a long time being honest. The incense I had lit when I came in was still burning, the thin thread of it rising in the still air and drifting toward the doorway. I stayed until it burned down. Then I went back to work. Edward Park sent a formal notice the following week, confirming that the registration of golden scissors under my name had been fully restored in the provincial records, with the LLC filing cancelled, and the documentation updated to reflect continuous operation from November 1994 to present. He included, in the same message, A note that the financial investigation into Kevin Lam's broader activities was proceeding through the appropriate channels and that my documentation had been useful to that process in ways that extended, as I had hoped, beyond my own case. I read the message once, filed it in the brown envelope with the other official documents, set the envelope in the tin box, and closed the lid. I did not open a bottle of anything. I did not call anyone to celebrate. I went to the salon and opened it at my usual hour and worked through the day and came home and made dinner for one and washed one plate and one fork and one glass and went to bed at a reasonable hour. This is what victory looks like when you are 69 years old and have been doing the work for 31 years. Not a culmination, not a transformation. Just the restoration of what was always yours, returned to you after a detour that cost more than it should have and taught you things you would rather not have needed to learn. Danny came by the salon 3 weeks after the sign went up. He did not come inside. He stood on the pavement and looked at the sign for a long time, the way I had looked at it on the morning it was installed, and then he came to the door and knocked, which was something he had never done before, had always simply walked in the way family walks into places they consider partly theirs. I opened the door. He looked at the sign, then at me. His face was the face of a man who has gone through something difficult and is on the other side of it and is not yet sure what the other side requires of him. "It looks right," he said, meaning the sign. "Yes," I said, "it does." He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets, not Kevin Lam's gesture, not the performance of confidence, but the gesture of a young man who doesn't know what to do with his hands when he is standing somewhere he has forfeited the easy comfort of. "I'm going to make this right," he said. "I know I can't undo it, but I'm going to spend however long it takes making it right." I looked at him for a moment, the baby who had been watchful from the first days, the boy on the front step learning the names of things, the man who had calculated the value of what I built and tried to take it, and then had stood in the wreckage of that attempt and chosen, however slowly, to turn back. "I know you will," I said. Not warmly, not coldly. Simply as a fact. The way I stated facts when I was certain of them. "It will take time. More than you think." "I know. Then come back when you've begun," I said. Not to be forgiven, just to show me. He nodded once. He left. I watched him walk down the street until he turned the corner. Then I went back inside and returned to my work, my hands moving through the familiar motions, the comb and the scissors and the particular quiet of an afternoon salon where the light comes in at an angle that makes everything look slightly warmer than it is. In the window glass, reflected faintly against the street outside, I could see the sign above the door. My name in gold letters, the scissors pointing the correct direction, Thomas's work carried forward in someone else's careful hands. My mother had stood on the step outside our childhood house on evenings when the water was still and set it to the air and to anyone fortunate enough to be nearby. Still water runs deepest. She had meant, the ones who say nothing are the ones who have already decided. She had meant, do not mistake silence for surrender. She had meant, the river does not argue with the stone. It simply keeps moving until the stone is somewhere else. I had kept moving. The stone was somewhere else. And the water, as it had always been, was still. If anyone in your life has ever looked past you like you weren't there, like your years, your sacrifice, your quiet strength somehow made you smaller instead of larger, this story was for you. The ones who built everything with their hands and asked for nothing in return are not invisible. They never were. They were simply waiting for the right moment to open the tin box. If Rose's story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Rose made the right choice by giving Danny a second chance? Or was the door already closed the moment he walked through it the first time?